All right, let's transition now to some prospects, and let's start along the defensive line. So here we're going to be sort of talking a little bit about some nose tackles, a little bit about some guys who project as 3-4 defensive linemen here, and then we'll save our edge rusher conversation for the next segment. I finally had a chance this week, Dave, to go through and sort of create a skeleton of my draft board for the 2026 NFL draft, at least on the defensive side. And going through, I had a whopping 11 interior defensive linemen in my top 100, my initial top 100, 13 in my top 150. So there is some talent at the top half of this class in the first 2 days of this draft along the interior of the defensive line. Some of those guys maybe even could slink their way into day 3. There were 4, when we're looking for guys who are going to blow up the combine, 4 players from Bruce Feldman's 2025 freak list that were invited to the combine along the defensive line. And there's just a lot of dancing bears and intriguing nose tackles in this class, which has got to get you really excited to see what they can do at the combine.
We've talked about wanting a big bodied sort of in the past, one tech, now nose tackle for this defense for years and years. And I feel like, is this the year we finally get it? It's a good class, I think, for that type of player, for a nose tackle style type of player. In the past, seems like many classes, there's been like 1 or 2 or 3 guys that kind of stood out as nose tackles. And obviously they were highly coveted. Alfred Collins, Devondre Sweat, those types of guys come to mind. But now this year, you've got a number of guys that can fit that mold. And we don't have to necessarily be like, like that guy's a 3 tech, so we're not going to consider. Like, there's plenty of nose tackle options in this year's class. And so that's why, again, I'll get back to the point of like, it may not seem like a great class on paper when you kind of think about like the first round, and like there's not a ton of like, I guess super exciting names as far as like first round is concerned, and especially like people want to talk about offense. But on the defensive side and the interior defensive line, I'm really liking the depth of this class. I think there's a good range of like, top end type guys, middle tier type guys, and plenty of guys towards the end of the draft that, again, if the Bills want to, we always say the phrase double dip at this position, there are options here depending on what they do in free agency. So I like this interior defensive line class, especially from the nose tackle perspective.
Yeah. John Robert comes in and says Caleb Banks could be a nose tackle. Let's start with Caleb Banks a little bit, because he's a guy I think a lot of people are going to have their eyes on at the combine. Had a big Senior Bowl week. A lot of people like to sort of comp him to Deion Walker, who the Buffalo Bills had a lot of success drafting last season. So it'll be interesting to see his measurements. It'll be interesting to see his agility, his testing, all of that good stuff at his size. He looks like he could be a really good odd front end, but just like Deion Walker, who could be an odd front end in like sort of that Calais Campbell mold, you can also see both of these guys being able to play that zero tech or that nose tackle as well. So Caleb Banks is a guy that I'm going to have my eye on at this combine, because he's someone who could realistically be into that in that 20s range.
Yeah, I mean, physically, you just look at Caleb Banks and he's rare in that sense, right? I mean, he's got that amazing sort of burst first step. Athletically, like you said, it'll be interesting to see how he tests. I imagine he's going to test very well. He's just a specimen. And, I do wonder about what his position will be at the next level. I think, you see, like you mentioned, Deion Walker, I think a lot of people will kind of prognosticate him as like being more of like a 3 tech style player in an interior. But I do think he could be sort of a weak side end in a 3-4, kind of in that same group with the Ed Olivers, with the TJ Sanders, and TBD on sort of where Deion Walker fits in to that. But if they view him as a guy who could play nose tackle, then that becomes very interesting, because then all of a sudden you have the thought of maybe a guy like Caleb Banks and Deion Walker at nose tackle and TJ Sanders and then Oliver at that weak side end position. And then you've got quite a bit of youth infused into that defensive front. You still have the questions around the strong side end spot, but Caleb Banks would be someone that really hard to pass on if he said he was there at
Yeah.
26. I think a lot of people probably have him maybe inside their top
Mhm.
20 or just outside. So I would be very intrigued
Yeah.
with Caleb Banks.
And Nathan E comes in with a great comment. He says, I don't love people always calling tall, big defensive tackles automatically nose tackles. You need a certain kind of body type to be a true nose tackle. Yeah, like honestly, 6'6". We had these
Totally agree
conversations.
with that comment. Totally
We
agree with that comment.
we had this conversation last year with Deion Walker. Like 6'6", 6'7" could be a disadvantage because of leverage issues.
Mhm.
And Deion Walker sort of overcame that. So the issue is like, do the Bills even envision Deion Walker as a zero tech in this defense, or do they envision Deion Walker as a strong side 5-eye type of guy? And then you have Ed Oliver and TJ Sanders as your weak side 5-eye. And then you have to go find that nose tackle. And there are plenty of nose tackles. We're about to talk about those nose tackles in a moment here. So that'll be super interesting. But they do have that flexibility to be able to, they do have the flexibility to be able to kick over to the zero tech. And that's kind of the intriguing part. Like if you have Deion Walker, you have Caleb Banks, you have both those guys you can mix into your defensive line rotation. Some of them, sometimes they can play zero tech, sometimes they can play 5-eye. Like you just like to have that kind of flexibility, especially since they're more natural pass rushers than maybe some of the nose tackles. There are some rare pass rushing nose tackles in this draft, which we're going to talk about again in a moment. But Tom Slade comes with a great comment. He says, nose tackles equal fire hydrant greater than dancing bear. You're not going to find any disagreements from the Air Raid Hour with that take there. But Caleb Banks is interesting at that 6'6", 335-pound frame. How does Jim Leonard view it? Right? Like how does he want this defensive line to look?
Yep.
Because you have a guy who is size-wise similar to Deion Walker and Caleb Banks. And I think Xavier Harris is another guy. Do the Bills, whether it's Caleb Banks or whether it's Xavier Harris, because Xavier Harris, it'll be interesting to see his final measurements. But right now, he is reported to be, I don't have the arm length or anything, but Xavier Harris is reported to be 6'8", 330. So these two guys, the 6'6", 315 Caleb Banks, the 6'8", 330 Xavier Harris, these two guys, are they redundant? Excuse me. And I said 315 for Caleb Banks. I meant 335. I misread my notes there.
Mm-hmm.
Are these guys redundant? Just a small 20-pound error there. Are those guys redundant with Deion Walker, or can they flexibly play with Deion Walker? That's a question you have. There are some other guys in this draft that I really like, but I question whether they're redundant with Ed Oliver and TJ Sanders. I love Grayson Halton from Oklahoma. A lot of people say, oh, he's an even front 3 tech, but he could be a 4-eye weak side guy like Ed Oliver and TJ Sanders. Oh, Zane Durant from Penn State is one of my favorite guys in this draft. A lot of people say Zane Durant is an even front 3 tech, but could he be a weak side 4-eye? But is that redundant because we have Ed Oliver, because we have TJ Sanders? So there are some guys where it's like, they're cool prospects and they're fun prospects. And it's going to be awesome to keep an eye out for them at the combine. But are the Bills even considering those guys, considering the needs they have along the defensive line?
Well, and I think we don't, maybe this would be a question for Brandon Beane at the press conference, right? And maybe it's more of he's going to redirect it to Jim Leonard, but it's like in the early goings, where do you envision lining up guys like Deion Walker, TJ Sanders, Ed Oliver, right, in this defense? Because at the end of the day, if the vision is that really all three of those guys are weak side ends, or maybe Deion Walker is the strong side end, you still have this big hole at nose tackle, I think, that needs to be filled. And so I agree with you, especially on a guy like Zane Durant, right? Like, do you need a third weak side end in this front? No, you probably more so need a nose tackle type of guy. So, yeah, I mean, again, it kind of gets back to my comment from before. Like, we've always talked about like a lot of 3 tech guys that we like in these prior drafts, and it's always been, well, it's a little bit redundant with Ed Oliver and so and so. And so is it the same kind of conversation again, but just now more for that weak side end spot in this defense? I think it could be.
Yeah, and we got a couple of more guys that I think could be edge guys in this 34 odd front defense. I really like Christian Miller from Georgia as a 4-eye odd front guy. I have him in my top 75, and I really like Tyler Onedium from Texas A&M as an odd front end. So keep an eye out for those two as well. Just want to make sure I name drop those two guys. They're in my top 100. But if we're looking again now, maybe towards nose tackles, and we didn't talk about Peter Woods from Clemson either. To me, he's a 43 3 front 3 tech. He's one of the bigger. He's probably the number one defense tackle on most people's boards.
Yep.
But if we are talking about pure nose tackles, right? Two of my favorite guys in the draft. I know they're two of your favorite guys in the draft. We've already had extensive conversations on both of these guys, Lee Hunter and Caden McDonald. Both, I think, in play at 26. That's how good they are at nose tackle. But then you have Dante Corleone, who's in my top 100. Daryl Jackson Jr., who's in my top 100. Dominique Orange, Big Citrus, who's in my top 100. You have Nick Barrett out of South Carolina, who's just outside of my top 100 in my top 150. So you have, I just listed what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 nose tackles who the Buffalo Bills could legitimately take in the first 4 rounds of the draft in different spots.
Yeah, I mean, Caden McDonald tops the list for me right now in the early goings. Lee Hunter very close behind on my preliminary rankings. I don't have a full skeleton yet of the entire big board. I'm doing more relative rankings within each position for the moment until I put my final sort of board together. But as it stands right now, I do have Caden McDonald slightly ahead of Lee Hunter. But I will tell you this, I would be, as it stands right now, again, on February 23rd before free agency, I'm comfortable taking either of those guys at pick 26 as it stands right now. Caden McDonald right now is my overall interior defensive lineman 4. Lee Hunter is my overall interior defensive lineman 5. So for me, that's where I have them slotted right now. Look, I think it was very widely reported that Lee Hunter was probably the best interior defensive lineman at the Senior Bowl practice all week. And then obviously you have Caden McDonald, who was PFF's best ranked run defender of all interior defensive linemen in the class and number 1 stop percentage of all interior defensive linemen in the class with at least 150 run defense snaps, excuse me. So look, I don't think you can go wrong with either one of those guys. Super high on both of them.
Yeah. I mean, Lee Hunter, right? 90th percentile pass rush win rate, 98th percentile run stop rate, 95th percentile in average depth of tackle, and 86th percentile in splash plays, all per PFF. That is what a first round defensive tackle looks like. That is what a game breaking nose tackle looks like. We talk about the impact that a Justin Simmons has on a defense. We talk about the impact that a Chris Jones has on a defense. Bills fans have been clamoring for that. I know Hunter is a little bit of an older prospect, so there are some questions about that. But legitimately, if you look at the metrics and maybe if the testing backs it up, Lee Hunter, it seems to me like the age seems to be the only thing keeping him out of the top 15.
And I'll say this.
I don't understand why he's talked about in the 20s or as a second round pick. I don't get that chatter.
And I think age matters more to where certain teams are sort of in their builds. I think for the Bills, age should matter almost zero, to be honest. When you have like this new coaching staff coming in, you have Josh Allen now headed towards the back 9 of his, career and maybe sort of towards like the next, just couple years of really truly being in his prime. I'm not saying he's, declining or anything like that. Age should be less of a factor for the Bills when drafting, in my opinion.
Pass rush win rates for the top 2026 draft DTs for at the combine. Christian Miller, who I mentioned earlier, I like as an odd man 4i, 11.9%. Lee Hunter, 11.8%. Caleb Banks in 2024, 11.2%. Grayson Halton, 10.4%. Peter Woods, 8.1%. Dominique Orange, Big Citrus, 6.9%. Daryl Jackson Jr., 5.8%. Of the top 7 guys, 1, 2, 3 of them are pure nose tackles in pass rush win rate. That's pretty rare to see that many pure nose tackles. When we look at Dominique Orange and Dante Corleone, both of these guys made Bruce Feldman's freak list. So here's what we can expect from Big Citrus, Dominique Orange at the combine. It was his second appearance in 2025 on Bruce Feldman's freak list. 6'4", 325 pounds. He spent much of his offseason refining his diet. He benched 450 pounds, squatted 650, and cleaned 365. He also vertically jumped 34 inches. That's disgusting for a guy the size of Dominique Orange. And then you have Dante Corleone, the Godfather, a guy who I've been wanting to declare for the draft since his redshirt sophomore year, but he has decided to stay in college year after year after year. And the interesting thing for Corleone that you're going to have to consider at the combine is he refused to weigh in at the Shrine Game. And some people projected that he was maybe up to around 360 pounds. So that's going to be really interesting to see what the weight of Dante Corleone is, the Godfather is, at the combine. He made Bruce Feldman's freak list 3 times over the course of his collegiate career, listed at 6 foot. So he's shorter, squattier, fire hydrant, right? 336 pounds. He bench pressed 485 pounds last summer, squatted 615, and can do the sumo deadlift at 585. Despite his massive body, Corleone has very nimble feet. This offseason, he clocked a 171 10-yard split, which would have been third fastest among defensive tackles at last year's combine. His 7.44 second 3-cone drill also would have been third fastest at the combine in his position group. So this is a dancing bear and a fire hydrant in one in Dante Corleone. So he is definitely a guy, the Godfather, right? Can be the Godfather of Bills Mafia that Bills fans need to keep their eye on. I know a lot of people love Big Citrus. A lot of guys love Lee Hunter. A lot of guys love Katie McDonald. Don't forget about Dante Corleone out of Cincinnati. I know he's got some injury things. Some medicals are going to be big for him. And I know he stayed in college for longer than he probably should have at the University of Cincinnati. But he is a guy the Bills should definitely consider round 3. Love me some Dante Corleone. Somebody earlier said Albert Regis. I love Albert Regis out of Texas A&M, the nose tackle. I had him just outside of my top 50. I think he's a day 3 guy. Some other guys I like, Damone Capehart out of Clemson, an odd front end. Tim Keenan out of Alabama, the nose tackle. Rayshon Benny out of Michigan, an odd front end. Chris McClellan out of Missouri, nose tackle. I'm not very high on Chris McClellan. I know some people are. Gary Smith III, nose tackle out of UCLA. Brandon Cleveland out of NC State, a nose tackle with some length limitations, but he's a really good run stuffer. David Gusta out of Kentucky, nose tackle. And Dominic Williams out of Oklahoma, an even front 1 tech, a 4-eye end. I really like their games. And then we didn't really talk too much on Darrell Jackson Jr., but those 35-inch arms at 330 pounds and 6'5", Darrell Jackson Jr. is going to be a name that a lot of people want to talk about too. So just a loaded defensive line class for the Buffalo Bills to choose from and for Bills fans to sort of fawn over in this year's combine.
And I would expect Darrell Jackson Jr. is going to get more attention over the next week after his testing and workouts. I feel like he's going to be one of the guys that tests really well in Indy. And so like Darrell Jackson Jr., I think right now is my ideal 8. And I may move him up to 7 or 6, depending on sort of what happens here in Indy.